In this assignment, we will set up the enemies in the game. Each enemy will be on a set patrol route by default. If he is made aware of the player's location by seeing or hearing the player, by the player triggering an alarm system, or by another enemy spotting the player, then he should rush to the position of the sighting or the triggering alarm. If, however, the enemy can see and has line of sight to the player, he should instead shoot the player.
Simulation restarting.
There will be two variables for storing the player's location. One global variable that all the enemies will be sent to, and one personal variable that only the specific enemy will be sent to. When the player is spotted, either by an enemy or an alarm system, this will set the global variable, which has already been created in our last player sighting script. When the player is heard by an enemy, either by running or using the attract attention feature, only the personal variable will be set. If the global variable is not set to the reset value, indicating that the player has been spotted, then the enemies should set their personal variable to match the global variable's value and converge on the sighting position. The enemies will have two colliders, a large sphere trigger collider and a capsule collider. The sphere will be used as the enemy's range of sight and hearing. The capsule will be used for normal collisions. Because the enemies will be moving with colliders, they will also need a rigid body component. This will be kinematic because the enemies should not react to collisions and the movement will be dictated by the Nav Mesh. As such, the enemies will also need a Nav Mesh agent component. The Nav Mesh agent will physically move the enemy character, and this will provide information that we can feed into the animator controller to define which animation should be played to match this movement. The enemies will be using a total of 5 scripts, 4 of which will be applied as components to the enemy, and 1 which will be a helper class. The scripts will be as follows. Enemy sight. This will work as the enemy's ears and eyes. This script will be used to detect when the player is within the sphere trigger collider. Animator setup. This script will be a helper class that is not applied to the enemy as a component. Instead, an instance of the class will be created in another script so that the function from it can be used. This will perform the task of sending information from the enemy animation script to the animator controller. This will take information about direction and velocity from the Nav Mesh agent and manipulate it into a form that can be used by the animator setup script to apply to the animator controller. Enemy AI. This works as the enemy's brain and controls the way it behaves based on whether the player is in sight or not. It then feeds the information to the Nav Mesh agent to determine what the enemy should do. Enemy shooting. This controls the actions that are performed when the enemy is shooting the player, including the amount of damage and the rate of fire. The first thing to do when creating an enemy is to drag the enemy FBX into the scene. Grab Char Robot Guard and drop it in. We'll put him just outside the door of the second room at -18, 0, 6.5. As with all dynamic game objects in the scene, we'll make sure it's using light probes. Open the hierarchy and select the body, then check Use Light Probes. We also need to do this for the helmet, located under the skeleton, hips, spine, neck, head part of the hierarchy. This will mean that the robot is dynamically lit in the scene. Before we add any components to it, let's tag the parent game object enemy. Select it from the tag dropdown. Notice that because this asset was imported with a rig, we automatically have an animator component that's waiting for a controller asset which we will create later. The first components we should add are the colliders. We will start with the sphere collider. We will need the center of the collider to be at the center of the enemy, which is +1 in the y-axis. The radius is the range of sight the enemy will have, so 10 is a good starting point, but we can adjust this later if we need to. Most importantly, this collider needs to be a trigger, so we'll check that box now. Next, the Capsule Collider. We need to have this in addition to our Sphere Collider, so we'll add it to a child game object called char robot guard body. Again, the center needs to be moved up by 1, but this time we only need the radius to be 0.3. We also need to change the height to 2. We will add the rest of the components to the root game object. Since we have colliders that move, we will add a rigid body. We need this to be kinematic so that the enemy doesn't bounce when it hits something. We now need the Nav Mesh agent. Almost all of the starting parameters are fine, but we want to adjust the stopping distance to 0.8. Now that we have the Nav Mesh agent on the enemy, this is a good time to bake our Nav Mesh. In order for parts of the environment to be included in the bake, they should be marked as navigation static. Everything that we marked as static when we baked the light map will by default also be navigation static. But we can check whether this is the case by seeing if the static checkbox on the top right in the inspector is checked, and by looking in the drop-down to the right of this to ensure that navigation is included. First, open the env stealth static game object so that the groups of game objects show. We want the debris, ground, lift shaft, props, and both of the walls to be navigation static. We also want the battle bus and all of the switch units to be navigation static. Here we are simply checking that navigation static is checked for each of these objects. It should already be. Now open the navigation panel. You can do this through Window, Navigation, if you don't already have it open. We have a couple of settings we want to make sure of before we bake the Nav Mesh. Under the Bake tab, we want the radius to be 0.3. This will mean that enemies can fit through slightly tighter spaces. The height should be 1. If this was too low, then the Nav Mesh would go under things like the battle bus, causing the enemies to try and run through it. All that's left to do now is click Bake. This should only take a few seconds. That concludes the setup of the enemy. So now is a good time to save the scene and our project. In the next assignment, we will create the animated controller for the enemy.